Coming up next, it was a transatlantic musical arms race. Two titanic rock and roll bands, trading punches and landmark records, each chasing perfection and forever changing how we listen to music. In the midst of this musical battle, one genius whizkid envisioned the perfect album, a record to end all records, an innovative masterpiece. The symphony was already playing in his head, and he knew if he could get it down on vinyl, it would push the boundaries of music beyond what anyone thought was ever possible. But what he didn't count on was losing his sanity in the process. In a state of drug-addled madness, he came to a crashing halt, and so did this record, leaving us all wondering what might have been. The story of the greatest unreleased album of all time and an interview with its genius is coming up on a special episode of Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time, especially today. You know, if you remember doing it country cool, you're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Make sure to subscribe below right now. Click the bell and, so you always know when our stuff's coming out. Also, check us out on Patreon. There you'll find an additional catalog of exclusive content. You can become an honorary producer to help us curate this music history. Very special episode today. You know, the Beach Boys started their career in the early 60s riding high as America's ultimate surf band. It was all California fun in the sun, girls, cars, catching waves, and Billboard hits. The Beach Boys kicked out 7 top 10 albums between 62 and 65.
Come on, baby, wait and see. Yes, I'm gonna take you. You'll catch him surfing outside Ventura County. Praise, you gotta catch a wave and you're sitting on top of the world.
By 1966, the Beach Boys had transformed into America's top pop group, even giving the Beatles a run for their money, if only for a few hot minutes. Between 1965 and 1967, it was a transatlantic musical arms race to see which of these two top-tier bands could push the boundaries of popular music to its greatest level. Now, the Beatles' Rubber Soul inspired Brian Wilson to write Pet Sounds, which in turn led to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And in the midst of all that, Brian Wilson aspired to create the ultimate rock and roll album of all time, a project he would eventually call Smile. But you know, even going up against the stiffest competition on the block, Beach Boys mastermind Brian Wilson was always an admirer of the Fab Four. In his memoir, he summed their musical contest up in friendlier terms. He said, and I quote, "People talk about a rivalry between the Beach Boys and the Beatles, but that's not the right word. There were messages that got sent back and forth across the ocean. They would do something and I would hear it, and then I would want to do something just as good." End of quote. It was as simple as that. So when the Beatles released Rubber Soul in December of 1965, Brian Wilson was stunned. He was stunned at what he heard. The high song quality and the cohesion of this album, it really affected him deeply. Years later, Brian Wilson would recall being blown away by songs like You Won't See Me, and I'm Looking Through You, and Girl. The lyrics, the melodies, the production, the harmonies, it was all intensely unique. It was like nothing he had ever heard. Rubber Soul, of course, also boasted Beatles classics like Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, my favorite Beatles song of all time, and In My Life, another one. That's no wonder Brian was so smitten with it.
Isn't it good, Norwegian Wood? In my life, I've loved them all.
Said Brian in 2004, Rubber Soul was a challenge to me to do something similar. That made me want to make Pet Sounds. I didn't want to do the same kind of music, but I wanted to do it on the same kind of level. Like being hit by a bolt of lightning, Brian instantly realized he had to up his game. And in a sudden rush of creative inspiration, he began writing the timeless standard, God Only Knows.
God only knows what I'd be without you.
With the help of lyricist Tony Asher, Brian wrote songs and produced sessions for Pet Sounds, a collection that he hoped would be the greatest rock album ever made. An album that was, all killer, no filler. Brian Wilson described Pet Sounds as an interpretation of Phil Spector's famed Wall of Sound production and explained that if you listen to Pet Sounds as a collection of standalone but connected art pieces, you could get what he was aiming for. Now, Pet Sounds wasn't necessarily a song concept album or lyrically a concept album. Rather, in Brian's words, it was a production concept album. However, as Brian collaborated with Tony Asher on the lyrics and, of course, the Wrecking Crew, the best of the best, the rest of the Beach Boys were really relegated to vocals only. Now, this created some resentment and resistance within the Beach Boys, especially since the album's material was a major departure from the traditional Beach Boys, fun in the sun fare. In fact, Mike Love would famously say, and I quote, "Don't mess with the formula," but he didn't exactly use that word. Apparently, he didn't want the surf car girls formula to be trifled with. He even inspired the name of the album, Pet Sounds. Rumor is Brian called it Pet Sounds when Mike said, and I quote, "Brian, you're making music only a dog can hear." Now, he's changed his story. Actually, a lot of this stuff has changed. Over the years, stories, they've changed many times, but the truth is Brian was doing something no one had ever done before, so it created some fear, some tension. Their label Capitol was also resistant to release an album they believed was short on hits. But Pet Sounds was history in the making. It's best understood by visionaries and not the short-sighted, really. The songs come together to create a flawless collection, touching on themes of teenage infatuation with Wouldn't It Be Good, doubt with God Only Knows, and the loss of innocence with Caroline No.
Wouldn't it be nice if we could wake up? Oh, Caroline, no.
Released in May of 1966, Pet Sounds was met by praise from the critics. Unfortunately, it failed to impress American audiences from the sales side of things. It started off slowly compared to prior Beach Boys records. Maybe it was just too sophisticated for those who were used to lighter fare. After all, Brian was getting deeper than, fun, or I Get Around. As great as those tracks are, don't get me wrong. Now, it was reported that Brian was completely devastated by the so-called commercial failure of Pet Sounds in the States. You'd only have to wait about a decade or so and it would be something different. It got a US top 10 ranking, it had a couple of top 10 singles, but the album's commercial prospects, they weren't as good as before, but it would become one of the few Beach Boys studio albums to certify platinum in the States. It would come later. Plus, Pet Sounds, of course, is universally revered as the greatest album of all time. It is. It's my personal favorite album of all time. No matter the time, no matter what year we're in, it's going to be considered one of the best produced and most influential rock LPs of all time. 1,000 years from now, people will marvel at it. Now in the UK, Pet Sounds fared a lot better. It hit number 2 on the charts. It earned the Beach Boys the Best Group honors in New Music Express, their year-end poll, ahead of the Beatles. Speaking of the Fab Four, after hearing Pet Sounds, they were blown away. It was their turn to up the ante. Thanks to this landmark album, Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr were inspired to write the acclaimed Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Get this, while recording Sgt. Pepper, Paul McCartney was actively and strategically listening to Pet Sounds. He was aiming for that similar impact in sonic perfection. Speaking of sonic perfection, I got it around my neck right here. Man, gotta tell you about another hi-fi companion that I love from Campfire Audio's Chromatic series. It's called Bonneville, offering a sound that is the perfect blend of technical performance. Bonneville features a newly developed dual magnet dynamic driver that reaches deep into the lowest bass frequencies to create a foundational textured bass response. Another incredible feature is Bonneville's tuning. It makes it a super versatile earphone that expertly handles a wide variety of genres and applications. My priority when I use in-ear monitors is having a full music listening experience, so I can confidently recommend Bonneville to the true audiophiles out there. It's my favorite headphone right now. Bonneville is available in both custom and universal fit using a lightweight, durable 3D printed lacquered shell finish with a hand-polished stainless steel cap. It's actually a work of art, created around world-class technology. Like all of Campfire's wired earphones, Bonneville is carefully handcrafted by a small, expert team in Portland, Oregon. You can learn more about Bonneville and Campfire's full lineup of premium earphones at campfireaudio.com. Click on our link below or our info button right up here. So Paul McCartney later called Pet Sounds his favorite album of all time. Said McCartney, and I quote, "We put a song out, Brian would hear it and he'd do one." Which is nice, like me and John, you know. We kind of try to top each other all the time, but he eventually came out with God Only Knows. That was a sound stomper on Pet Sounds. I just think it's a great song. Melody, harmonies, words, it's a great song. I love it. Actually, my favorite Beach Boys song. He's also said it's one of his favorite songs of all time.
If you should ever leave me.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band would be released the following year. We're going to get more into that in a second. But before any of that, Brian Wilson made another significant contribution to the rock and roll canon with the song Good Vibrations. Released in October of '66, the Beach Boys' triumphant single was originally written for Pet Sounds. However, Brian removed it from the track list to give himself a little bit more time for the production. Boy, Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations back to back. Brian would recount that this otherworldly track was cut at 5 studios to get 5 different sections of the song. The record itself took 6 weeks, with Brian working on it every single day. At the end of those 6 weeks, Brian had an absolute masterpiece. This incredible musical mashup with its tempo shifts, its incredible dynamics, its far-out lyrics, and that eerie vibe from a DIY theremin, that won Wilson and the band props from every musician out there. They gave the Beach Boys their 3rd U.S. #1 single. It still stands as one of the best singles ever released. With Good Vibrations complete, Brian worked frantically on the next Beach Boys album throughout late 1966 and early '67. He initially dubbed the project Dumb Angel, but he later renamed it Smile. Smile promised to be a major artistic leap beyond even Pet Sounds, and it was described by Brian as a teenage symphony to God. So for this project, Brian Wilson collaborated with lyricist Van Dyke Parks, much to the disappointment of Tony Asher. Parks, an eccentric, he shared Brian's visions of grandeur. But the album would be fraught with delays and detours, and as this epic project progressed, Brian's actions became increasingly erratic. First of all, he tore his house apart and pitched a full-sized Arabian tent in the living room. And then in the dining room where his grand piano was stationed, he transformed the floor into a sandy oasis. Put the piano in the middle of a sandbox, which became inundated with dog poop. This was the inspiration that was in the air, as it seems the Beatles and the Beach Boys, after releasing Revolver and Pet Sounds along with Good Vibrations, respectively were on a collision course. A race to create the greatest, most experimental record in pop music history. Who would win the great race? Who would get there first? Who would take music beyond anyone's imagination? So back in the studio, Brian plowed ahead, chasing perfection, no less eccentric. For the fire section of the 4-part suite, The Elements, there were reports that Brian lit small bucket fires in the studio to enhance the atmosphere. However, according to those who were present, this never happened, said studio musician Carol Kay, and I quote, "Brian was way too professional for that. He did bring some plastic fireman hats to Gold Star Studio, but Lyle Ritz was the only musician who wore one. I distinctly remember the fire sessions because I was amazed at how Brian got the cellos to sound like real fire engines." End of quote. That in itself is, of course, impressive. However, when a fire broke out near the LA recording studio where he was taping Fire, Wilson was terrified. He was convinced that his music had telepathic properties capable of provoking God's wrath. Pressure to pull the project together was mounting by February of '67. That's when Brian first heard the Beatles' next offering on the radio. It was Strawberry Fields Forever. Brian was floored, completely shook. Upon hearing it, he believed that the Beatles, they'd already achieved his vision for Smile. Wilson felt he could no longer compete, and it was all downhill from there. Making things worse, his mental state was deteriorating thanks to escalating drug use. Telling it like it is, Brian said, "Because I was on drugs, I couldn't concentrate, and the music requires a lot of concentration." Now, the rest of the Beach Boys had reached the end as well. They felt Brian's increasing dependence on marijuana and LSD were impairing his judgment. It really became a hostile environment, and a wedge was driving between Brian and the rest of the band, particularly Mike Love, who was openly and blatantly opposed to Wilson's direction on Smile. He wouldn't keep his mouth shut about it. Love wanted to go back to the commercial pop stylings of their surfer days, their car days, and he butted heads, especially with Van Dyke Parks. In fact, he did it so much that the lyricist quit. Brian, for his part, felt like the rest of the band were holding his genius back. As recording for Smile dragged on into spring of 1967, Brian worked fewer hours, and for the first time, he seemed confused about the direction that he wanted to go with the album. So after 80-plus recording sessions between August of 66 and May of 67, which actually amounted to about 50 hours of recording, Brian Wilson pulled the plug on this project. He'd pushed himself too hard and too far trying to beat the Beatles. Incidentally, just a few weeks later, the Fab Four, they released their rebuttal to Pet Sounds and they beat Brian to the punch. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band dropped on May 26 of 1967. Reportedly, Brian was horrified when he heard it. It was that good. The Beatles had just dropped the bomb, and Brian, he wouldn't recover for decades.
I get high with a little help from my friend. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. He didn't notice that the lights had changed.
Now, sadly, Smile would pass into the realm of a legend, never actually receiving an official release. The seemingly unending hours spent to create it now compromise one of popular music's devastating stories. What could have been? Said Brian about it in 2004, and I quote, "Smile wasn't anything like the Beatles. It wasn't really pop music. It was something more advanced." He also added, "I thought it was too weird. I thought it was too druggy influenced. I thought the audience just wouldn't get it." Man, I wish we would have had the chance. I personally believe if Smile had come out before Sgt. Pepper, it would have changed music forever. It could have been the most sophisticated pop record of the 20th century, but it just wasn't to be. So then the aftermath. Tragically, the Smile project and Brian's relentless use of drugs destroyed his psyche. It sent Brian into a decades-long downward spiral. Thankfully, though, that wouldn't be the end. As far as the rest of the band, after Brian gave up the ghost on Smile, his bandmates convened to salvage what material they could from the would-be recording sessions. The group released Heroes and Villains as a single in the summer of 67. That song was actually Brian and Van Dyke Parks, their first collaboration together. It was intended to be on Smile, of course. Though highly publicized, Heroes and Villains failed to reach the commercial heights of Good Vibrations. It did peak at number 12 in the Hot 100. It fell off the chart a week later. Smile's other tracks would be dispersed over the group's next few albums, including the makeshift LP built from the Smile sessions, Smiley Smile. That album dropped on September 18th, 1967. It's actually the Beach Boys' first record, aside from their Christmas album, to fail to break into the Billboard Top 40. It was a significant drop from Pet Sounds' number 10 ranking. Carl Wilson famously described this LP as a bunt instead of a grand slam. It was a far cry from the symphony that Brian heard in his head. Of the 12 original Smile tracks, 5 were included on Smiley Smile, but only 2 somewhat resemble Brian's original ideas. My favorite song from Smile, Surf's Up.
To a muted trumpeter's swan.
So while the Beatles were headlining the psychedelic age, the Beach Boys were stalling out. Before 67 was over, a lot of people believed the Beach Boys were washed up. Reworked Smile tracks were included on the Beach Boys' next 2 albums, Wild Honey and Friends, but by this point, they'd become little more than filler. Talks of finishing Smile would persist for years. including in 1972 when Carl Wilson announced the album's imminent release. But without Brian's direction, it was little more than a pipe dream. Brian, like I said, had an emotional breakdown. He would essentially disappear for decades and battle demons that nobody could possibly understand. He spent almost 3 years in his room, and then, of course, taken advantage of by Dr. Gene Landy for many years, stealing his music, even part of his soul, until Brian's late wife and close friends intervened and saved Brian. Years later, in 2004, Brian Wilson, Van Dyke Parks, and keyboardist Darian Sahanaja arranged a version of Smile for concert performances called Brian Wilson Presents Smile. This was then adapted by Brian into a solo album, which was released on September 28th of 2004. But Wilson has said this version was significantly altered from his original vision. Even so, the release was well received by critics and fans alike. I loved it. Brian Wilson Presents Smile. It peaked at number 13 on the Billboard 200. And from fall 2004 to summer 2005, Wilson supported the album with a world tour. I saw him on several occasions. So jump ahead to 2011, and the compilation, The Smile Sessions, was the first official package devoted to the original Beach Boys recordings. It included an approximation of what the completed Smile album might have sounded like. But what do you think would have happened if Brian had finished Smile back in the 60s? I really want to have a great discussion below about this. Would this legendary record have topped Sgt. Pepper's? Would the musical arms race have kept going with these two iconic bands, trying to one-up each other if Brian had stayed healthy? I was able to interview Brian Wilson about some of the key tracks on Smile. Very fortunate. It was such an honor. Here's that interview. Well, let's talk about Smile for a minute.
All right.
You were trying
I call
to do
that
Smile.
Teenage Symphony of God. Van Dyke Parks was responsible for a lot of that music, He and I collaborated a little bit, but he has also a lot to say about music.
And a lot of humor and things. What were you trying to say with Smile at the time?
We were just trying to say we captured the mood of early America, which is the best part of the album, and then mid-America, and then Hawaii. So, it covered a span all the way from early America all the way to the present time in Hawaii.
Very jovial album, too.
Yeah.
First movement, Our Prayer. Tell me about that song.
Our Prayer?
Yeah, how did that come together?
I wrote that a while before I met Van Dyke. And he said, let's put that right in the front of
And you start the concert off with it as well.
I would like to offer the world a little prayer.
This beautiful blend of those harmonies.
Thank you.
Heroes and Villains.
I've been in this town so long that back in the city I've been taken for lost.
Do you remember what inspired
I wrote that with Van Dyke in 1964. We had a sandbox in one of my rooms, and we took our shoes and socks off and rolled up our pants, and we put our feet in the sand, and we were actually on the beach in our minds. So we wrote a song called Heroes and Villains, which no one could have ever written.
Beautiful song. Cabin Essence. That rock and roll waltz.
Cabin Essence was a 3/4 wall. Bump it, jump it, jump it. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, like that, yeah.
Cabin essence time we have.
What about Wonderful? Beautiful chord pattern.
Wonderful.
Wonderful was probably one of the sweetest songs he and I ever wrote.
Yeah.
One of the sweetest, happiest songs we ever wrote.
Surf's Up. Let's talk about that track. That's my favorite.
Surf's Up is?
Yeah, my favorite
You really
song
like it?
of all time that you've ever done.
Surf's Up?
Yes.
Surf's up.
I have to disagree. I don't know. It's a good song, but it's too long. It just goes and goes and goes,
And then 37 years later, you got to release it.
Right.
And I got to tell you, Brian, this is the most anticipation I ever had for an album ever. Just a great, great record. Thank you for finishing this.
You're
Such a
very
beautiful,
welcome.
beautiful record.
In my personal opinion, Brian Wilson is the foremost musical genius of the rock era. His music has been the life preserver for me whenever I've gone through any trial. And I know a lot of you feel the same. God only knows what we'd be without him. Thanks so much for watching. Leave us a comment about Brian Wilson and Smile. What are your memories of this song? Let's have a great discussion below. If you like our content, we invite you to subscribe. We'd love to have you. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.